Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to talk today about George Washington, okay? And I think George Washington sometimes can get a bum rap, and it's kind of increasing now because this one lady wrote the book about his wife slave on a judge that had escaped him and Martha Washington. But in spite of that, George Washington was a very good man, and I honestly think he was a hero. And let me explain why. Not just a hero for Caucasian people, but a hero for all people, okay? Washington, when he was 17 years old, he was out surveying land. I mean, his father died when he was very, very young. And George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732. His father was Augustus Washington, and his mother was Mary Ball Washington. That was her name. And Mary Ball Washington was not very affectionate. She was a very demanding woman, and she got more demanding after Augustus had passed away. Now, George Washington had an older brother, Lawrence, and Lawrence looked after him. And George Washington wanted to be a British sailor, but his brother Lawrence talked him out of it. Said that it'll be like slavery if you are a British sailor. Now, there have been plenty of people that love their career in the Royal Navy. I personally know one guy who spent 8 years in the Royal Navy and liked it. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying this is what Lawrence told George. George did visit Barbados, and it was more like a working deal than a vacation, but he caught smallpox when he visited Barbados. That was actually the first time he had left and never colonial America, and the British colonies at the time, the British colonial America, and he got to Barbados, he caught smallpox, and the reason he had scars on his faces was because he had caught smallpox, but he got immune to it. And so in the American Revolution, when he fought, he didn't catch it or die from it, and a lot of his fellow soldiers did. All right, let's talk about the good things George Washington did, okay? All right, George Washington in the Continental Army, he served without pay, okay? He served without pay, volunteered to serve without pay, and he always led from the front, and when trenches needed to be dug, he would dig them with his soldiers. Now, being the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he could have been exempted from that, but he chose not to exempt himself from that, okay? And he allowed black soldiers, and his forces in the American Revolution were integrated. Washington called it a mixed multitude. Now, yes, at first, George Washington was not going to use black soldiers, but he changed that very quickly. He honestly realized he was going to need them, but once they got there, the black soldiers were pretty much treated like white soldiers. Most of the black soldiers that did fight for the Continental Army, they were awarded their freedom, particularly if their masters had arranged that. Not always, but usually they did. Like I said, it wasn't always the case, but usually they did. And like Oliver Cromwell and Prince Whipple were on the same boat as he was crossing the Delaware, and Oliver Cromwell was a free black already. Prince Whipple was free after the war. His master, William Whipple, said, if you fight for the Continentals, I'll free you after the war, and Prince was freed. But Oliver Cromwell was a free black already, and he served with pay, and he was wondering where his pension was when he got out of the, when the war was over, and George Washington saw the application for the pension and was very attentive to it and paid much attention to it and made sure Oliver got it. Now, he was not a champion, what I would call, of race relations. He had his reservations about blacks. He said they are extremely poor workers except under the closest to supervision, which is obviously not true. But he said that does not justify owning human beings like cattle. Now, he did own slaves, but he didn't beat his slaves. He made sure that they were not overworked. And then also, if the slaves were too old to work, he didn't sell them off or he didn't kill them. He kept them, and they basically couldn't do anything, but he didn't want to sell them off because he didn't want to see some other master kill them, which was a common practice at the time. And also, his slaves ran away at times, and he would go to the newspapers and ask for them back, but the only reason he did that is because he didn't want to see his plantation burned to the ground, and his neighbors would have done that had he not went to the newspapers and asked for him back. But he refused to send his hound dogs after him, and he refused to send search parties after him. The only exception to that was On a Judge, but On a Judge was Martha's slave. It was not George's slave, so that was under different circumstances. Martha already had slaves when she married George. Martha was a widow, and she had 2 children. George Washington was sterile. He couldn't have kids, but he raised Martha's 2 kids as his own. And he He was not a stepfather. He was a father. He was active in the kids' daily lives. He made sure they were brought up correctly. He made sure they were disciplined. He made sure they were competent, confident people. And there was a lot of evidence he probably did marry Martha for the money, but at the same time, he was very faithful to her. He never cheated on her, never stepped out on her. And Washington, as I said, never lied, cheated, or stole. And he wanted to abolish slavery when the American colonies broke free from Britain, but he knew he couldn't. He knew if he had abolished slavery, it would have been a civil war, and there would have been another. It had been a divided country because it was such a pro-slavery sentiment in the South at the time, and some northern states. But he really wanted to, and in his heart, he hated to sign the fugitive slave law, which did happen, but he just felt like there was nothing he could do, and he wanted to see America as a unified country. But then at the same time, he freed the slaves at his death, and one of the descendants is still a guide at Mount Vernon to this day, his Mount Vernon home. And Washington wanted to retire to Mount Vernon to be a farmer, but his former soldiers and his Virginians wanted him to run for president. He didn't want to run for president, but he felt like since so many people requested him to, that he should. And after 2 terms, he stepped down. And he could have easily been made king, but he chose not to be. And also, had he been captured in the American Revolution, he probably would have been brought to England and hung. But before he was hung, he probably would have been tied to a horse carriage and drugged for a little while. You know, Washington gave up a lot of that in doing what he thought was right. Like I said, he could have easily been made king. People were bowing down to him and stuff after the American Revolution, right when he became president, but he did his best to try to stop it because he didn't want that monarchy-type government. Also, he was not a good general at first. He made some really good decisions, but at the same time, he only won 30% of the battles he fought. Now, he always, as I said, led from the front. There were times where he had his horses shot out from under him. Bullets went through his clothes and everything else, but he wasn't wounded. And George Washington believed firmly that God kept him alive. And on George Washington's views on slavery, I'm getting a lot of that from British historian Paul Johnson, who wrote a book on George Washington. Okay, if a British historian wrote a book about George Washington that gave positive views of George Washington, Paul Johnson had nothing to gain by that. Okay, that's just common sense. Okay, I love the UK, but I'm an American, and that's, a disagreement we have, the American Revolution, and of who was on the right side. But okay, George Washington did not have a political party. While he believed political parties should have been outlawed, that violated freedom. He thought political parties were bad for the unity of the country and not getting things done. And he picked a really good cabinet. Henry Knox was a good soldier, so he made a good Secretary of War. That was what they called Secretary of Defense back then. Thomas Jefferson had good writing skills and also good people skills, so he was a good Secretary of State. And he also admired the French, and at the time, France was our closest ally. So he picked a really good cabinet as well. So this is why, like I said, we should admire George Washington. Yes, before he met Martha Washington, he never really had a steady girlfriend. Dating was really not his thing, and he didn't have a lot of gang, or a lot of swag. But at the same time, he was friends with William Fairfax and Sally Fairfax, married couple, and he fell in love with Sally. And through the writings, you could tell he was in love. And William was his best friend. He was in love with his best friend's wife. But there was no evidence that an affair ever took place. And if you look at the letters carefully, it probably didn't. That was how much of a man of principle George Washington was. He wanted the affair to take place, but he knew in his heart that it couldn't because it was morally wrong. And George Washington was, like I said, a man of principle. He had some ambitions, and like I said, there's a lot of evidence he may have not married Martha for the money. He married her for the money, not for love, but at the same time, he was extremely loyal and faithful to her. That he didn't want to chase Ona Judge when Ona escaped from Martha's custody, but he felt like because Martha was his wife that he needed to do that. But unfortunately for Ona Judge's sake, Ona escaped and George Washington never found her. But that's one blemish out of a man who had an extremely competent record of doing the right thing. And And he kept another civil war from happening right after the American Revolution. The Continental soldiers were not getting paid. Congress wasn't paying them. And George Washington knew about this. He knew these soldiers were armed. They were going to overthrow Congress. But George Washington said, no, let's not replace one form of tyranny with another. And it was, like I said, it broke his heart. But at the same time, he wanted to see the country built together. He wanted to see the country flourish. And he felt like he didn't need to plunge America into another civil war. And Washington did not have to suffer with his men at Valley Forge, but he chose to. And Martha Washington came down to check on him to make sure that he was okay. And she suffered with the soldiers as well. And that honestly built up his morale. Also, one of his favorite slaves, William Lee, everybody called him Billy. Billy served with George Washington. And George Washington was actually the happiest when William Billy Lee was right by his side, fighting alongside him. Actually, it was one time really cold night in the American Revolution, and they were going to get hypothermia if Billy didn't get under that blanket. And Washington said, "Come on, get under. You're going to get hypothermia. You're going to die if you don't." And Billy kept saying, "No, sir, I'll be fine here. No, sir, I'll be fine here." But Washington ordered him to. So he saved Billy's life then doing that. So, like I said, George Washington was a very good man. He mentions God a lot, but he calls God Providence. I believe that he was Christian, but there's a lot of evidence that he could have been deist too. But he was not indifferent to Christianity. Even if he was deist, he believed Christianity played well for good society and good government. So with what the federal government's doing now with Christianity, he would be shocked and he would have been appalled. So, we all talk about Captain America, and I got Captain America right here, but George Washington is a real Captain America. So, anyways, hope everyone's doing well. Take care. God bless, and bye-bye. Bye-bye.